There is something that many men fail to understand until it is too late, and it has nothing to do with what you say or what you do in any obvious way. It has to do with something far more silent, something she will never explain to you, and yet it can completely change the way she perceives you. If you stay until the end, you will understand why some relationships begin with so much hope and end with an emotional distance that no one knows how to repair. I am Liz Rose, a relationship expert, author, and researcher of emotional dynamics between men and women. For years, I have studied attraction, male behavior, emotional intelligence, and the patterns that bring people together or drive them apart. Today, I want to share with you what I've learned through my research, my professional experience, and the thousands of stories I've encountered throughout my journey. Now listen carefully. Many men believe that respect in a relationship is something stable, something that, once earned, simply stays. But the psychology of attraction and emotional bonding works in a far more dynamic way. Respect is not a title. It is not a label. It is a living perception that shifts according to your actions, your reactions, and above all, your emotional state toward life and toward her. And here is where the part that almost no one explains begins. A woman does not lose respect for a man overnight. She does not lose it because of one isolated mistake or one argument. That is what many men believe. But the reality is far more subtle than that. Respect begins to erode in small moments. In moments where she perceives something that emotionally mature women genuinely value: consistency. When you say one thing and do another, when you set a boundary and then quietly abandon it because you are afraid to make her uncomfortable, when you react from anxiety instead of calm, those are the moments that accumulate. It is not about being perfect. It is about being coherent. From what I've observed in my years of research, the human mind searches for signals of stability. And in the context of an intimate relationship, that stability translates directly into emotional security. When that security weakens, something shifts in the internal dynamic of how she perceives you, even if she never says a single word about it. And here I want to clarify something important. This has nothing to do with dominating, controlling, or imposing yourself. That is not respect. That is fear. And fear does not build healthy bonds. The respect I am talking about is a different kind of perception entirely. It is the feeling that you are in control of yourself, that you do not lose yourself emotionally inside the relationship, that you do not need to constantly prove your worth. Many men, without realizing it, begin to seek excessive validation when they feel insecure. They ask too many questions. They insist too often. They give in too quickly, and although their intentions are good, the psychological message being transmitted is different. My stability depends on your reaction, and over time, that alters the emotional dynamic completely. But what matters most is this: it does not happen because of a lack of love or a lack of personal value. It happens because of a lack of emotional awareness. Most men have never been trained to observe their own internal reactions inside a relationship. No one taught them to notice when they are acting from calm versus acting from anxiety. And without that awareness, it is very easy to lose your emotional balance without even realizing it. What makes this especially difficult is that she is not analyzing it logically either. It is not a conscious reasoning process on her part. It is a cumulative emotional perception. Small repeated signals over time create a general impression, and that impression is what begins to define the dynamic between you. What you will come to understand is that this is not about changing who you are. It is about understanding what your behavior is actually communicating when no one is telling you what is happening beneath the surface. What tends to confuse many men is this: they believe respect is lost because of one big mistake, something obvious, like a serious argument, a wrong decision, or a difficult emotional period. But perception in relationships does not function as a single event. It functions as an accumulation, and that changes everything about how you need to understand what is really happening. Think of a glass of water. Every inconsistent interaction, every impulsive reaction, every moment in which you betray yourself to avoid discomfort. None of it seems important on its own, but little by little, that glass fills up. The problem is never one drop. The problem is the level. When the perception of respect begins to decline, there's rarely a dramatic moment to announce it. What appears instead is far more subtle. Less admiration in her eyes, less emotional initiative, more distance in the way she responds. Many men interpret that as sudden disinterest, but in reality, it is a process. Here is a key insight I want you to hold on to. Respect is not just admiration for what you do. It is admiration for how you hold yourself emotionally when things do not go the way you expected. When you respond to frustration with calm, you communicate stability. When you overflow emotionally with ease, you communicate dependency. And the human mind, in a very automatic way, adjusts how it values the connection based on that perceived stability. This does not mean you should suppress your emotions. That would be a serious mistake. Emotional maturity is not the absence of emotions. It is regulation. Feeling something is completely valid, but losing yourself in what you feel is something else entirely. And this is where many men cross a line without noticing it. They begin to make the relationship the center of their emotional regulation. Their mood depends on how she responds. Their sense of security depends on her attention. Their peace of mind depends on her validation. From the outside, this is not always obvious, but emotionally, it is perceived. And what matters most is that she does not need to analyze it consciously. The human emotional system detects patterns before the mind can explain them. That is why a woman can sometimes be unable to say exactly what has changed, and yet feel with total clarity that something no longer feels the same. This is where something delicate enters the picture. When the perception of respect begins to drop, many men try to recover it by doing more. More attention, more availability, more explanations, more effort. But excessive effort coming from a place of insecurity does not correct the initial perception. Sometimes it reinforces it. It does not communicate stability, it communicates need. And excessive emotional need creates internal pressure within the dynamic. This is not a criticism. It is an incredibly common human pattern. What I find important to understand is that respect is not rebuilt through intensity. It is rebuilt through consistency, through actions that demonstrate you are in control of yourself, even when the emotional situation is uncomfortable. And that includes something many men find genuinely difficult: tolerating silence, tolerating uncertainty, tolerating the absence of an immediate response without falling into anxiety. Because that is where your true internal emotional state is revealed. Not in what you say when everything is going well, but in how you hold yourself when you have no control over the outcome. If you are beginning to recognize some of these dynamics in your own experience, this is not meant to create guilt. It is meant to create awareness, because what you cannot see, you cannot adjust. And what you cannot adjust, you will keep repeating. There comes a point in every relationship where the dynamic stops being obvious and becomes almost invisible. It is no longer the words that matter most, nor even the grand gestures. What begins to carry the most weight is the constant emotional tone between the two of you. And that tone cannot easily be faked. It is felt. This is where many men find themselves confused. They are doing the right things, saying the right things, genuinely trying to improve communication, and yet they feel that something has shifted. What shifted was not their effort. What shifted was the perception of internal stability. Because emotional attraction in a relationship is not sustained by compatibility or affection alone. It is sustained by a deep sense of balance between two emotional systems. When one of those systems becomes unstable, the other registers it, even without expressing it directly. That instability is not always obvious. Sometimes it shows up as constant doubt, a need for reassurance, or difficulty tolerating small tensions without resolving them immediately. But what matters most is not the presence of intense emotions. It is your relationship with those emotions. An emotionally grounded man is not one who never feels anxiety, insecurity, or frustration. He is the one who does not allow those emotions to drive his decisions. And here is a distinction I believe is critical, one that many people overlook entirely. Reacting emotionally is human, but building your behavior from that reaction, constantly and repeatedly, is what alters the perception of respect in an intimate dynamic. Because when your actions begin to depend too heavily on what you feel in any given moment, the other person stops perceiving emotional predictability in you. And the human mind needs a certain degree of predictability in order to build deep trust. Without predictability, there is constant evaluation. Without that constant evaluation dissolving, there is no true emotional relaxation. And when there is no emotional relaxation, the dynamic shifts, not because someone has stopped caring, but because the emotional system no longer feels the same stability it once did. Now, something else is worth understanding here. Many men interpret emotional distance as a loss of love or as direct personal rejection, but in most cases, that is not what is happening. It is not a question of love or the absence of love. It is a question of internal dynamic, of how the relationship feels, not just what is said about it. And that is more subtle than it appears. Because he can still be a good person, he can still be attentive, even affectionate. And yet the internal experience of the other person begins to shift. That is where the confusion lives. This is where a concept I have come to value deeply in my work becomes essential: congruence. Congruence is the alignment between what you feel, what you do, and how you hold yourself when no one is validating you externally. When that alignment exists, you project emotional coherence. When it does not exist, friction develops in how the other person perceives you. And that friction, over time, weighs on the relationship. Not because there is something fundamentally wrong with you, but because the human emotional system responds to patterns, not to intentions. This is hard for many people to accept because we would prefer that intentions were enough. But in real relationships, what is felt carries just as much weight as what is intended. That is why real change never begins on the outside. It begins in the way you relate to yourself in moments of discomfort. Because there, without an audience, without validation, without an immediate response, that is where the emotional foundation is built. The foundation that is later projected into the relationship. If this is starting to feel familiar, it is not an invitation to judge yourself. It is an invitation to begin seeing what normally goes unnoticed, because what you cannot see is what influences you the most. At this point, most men start looking for the wrong answer. They begin asking themselves, what should I say? What should I do to make her see me the same way again? How do I recover what we had before? But the emotional perception of respect does not respond well to that kind of approach when it comes from emotional urgency, because urgency changes the internal energy with which you act, and that energy is perceived before any words are spoken. There is something that is rarely explained with clarity. The perception of respect in a relationship is not a fixed state. It is a continuous evaluation, not a conscious judgment, but an automatic reading. And when that reading changes, the dynamic changes with it. One of the most common mistakes at this stage is trying to recover lost perception through constant demonstrations, more explanations, more attention, more visible effort. But from a psychological standpoint, an excess of demonstration can produce the opposite of the intended effect, because it communicates a need for external correction. And when external need dominates, the perception of emotional independence diminishes. This does not mean becoming distant or cold. That would simply be another form of imbalance. What I am describing is something more nuanced. It is the difference between stopping acting from reaction and beginning to act from conscious choice. When you respond from reaction, your behavior is driven by the emotional moment. When you respond from choice, your behavior reflects internal stability, even when there is emotional turbulence underneath. Because what the other person evaluates is not only what you do, but where it comes from. This is something I have observed consistently throughout my research and in the stories shared with me over the years. The coherence between internal emotion and external behavior is one of the primary factors that sustains the perception of respect over time. And when that coherence breaks repeatedly, the relationship enters a state of emotional recalibration. It is not always conscious, but it is real. There is also another common idea worth dismantling. The idea that respect is something given to you or taken from you as though it were an object. In reality, respect is a dynamic response to how you present yourself emotionally within the bond. That means it is neither permanent nor inherently fragile. It is adaptable. It can grow or diminish according to repeated patterns, not isolated moments. A single argument does not define a relationship, but a consistent way of reacting absolutely can redefine it. And this is where something most men are never taught becomes essential: self-observation. Most men have not been emotionally educated to observe their own patterns of reaction in real time. No one taught them to notice when they are entering anxiety, when they are giving in from fear, or when they are seeking validation instead of acting from clarity. Without that observation, behavior becomes automatic. And what is automatic in relationships tends to become repetitive without any conscious intention. What this means is straightforward, even if it is not always easy to accept. You do not need to change who you are, but you do need to see more clearly how you are behaving under emotional pressure, because it is under pressure that the real dynamic reveals itself, not when everything is calm. If any of this feels uncomfortable, that is not a sign of personal failure. It is a sign of emerging awareness, and emerging awareness is where everything begins to shift. There is one more thing I want you to sit with. The loss of respect does not always feel like an obvious rejection. Sometimes it feels like a normalization of distance. There is no longer intense conflict, but there is no longer the same emotional intensity either. There are no constant arguments, but there is no longer the same mutual curiosity that once existed. And in that in-between space, many men become confused. They interpret the calm as stability, but sometimes that calm is something else entirely. Gradual emotional disconnection. From what I have studied and observed, this happens when the emotional system stops perceiving growth or adjustment within the dynamic. It does not mean someone has stopped caring. It means the relationship has entered a state of low emotional responsiveness. And here, something important deserves your attention. Human beings bond deeply through the sensation of shared emotional movement. When a relationship advances, adjusts, rebalances, the bond feels alive. But when everything becomes predictable, when there is no healthy tension or internal growth, the emotional system can begin to quietly dim. Not dramatically, gradually. And the hardest part to detect is that from the outside, everything can appear normal. But internally, the connection no longer feels the same. One of the most common errors at this point is attempting to recover lost intensity through external actions. More plans, more messages, more effort to generate an emotional reaction. But if the internal foundation has not genuinely changed, those actions tend to feel like compensation, not real evolution. And the human mind distinguishes between the two, even without articulating it, because what is perceived is not only the action itself, but the emotional intention behind it. This is where what I call self-generated stability becomes essential. Self-generated stability is the capacity to maintain a relatively coherent internal state, regardless of the immediate response from your environment. It is not indifference, it is self-regulation. When a person carries that stability, their presence feels more grounded, not because they do more, but because they react less from emotional urgency. And that directly influences how respect is perceived within the bond. Because at its deepest level, respect is closely connected to the perception of internal control. Not control over the other person, but control over yourself. When that internal control is inconsistent, the relationship begins to feel emotionally unstable for both people, even when neither can fully articulate why. Here is what I want you to understand. Many people believe the problem lies in what the other person is doing, but in most of the situations I have encountered in my research and in the stories shared with me, the root is internal instability. You can try to adjust behaviors on the surface, but if the emotional foundation remains reactive, the pattern will simply repeat itself in different forms. This is not a judgment. It is one of the most consistent observations in the study of relationships and human behavior, and it is also an opportunity, because what becomes conscious stops being automatic, and what stops being automatic can begin to transform, not immediately, not perfectly, but genuinely. And so, perhaps the most important question you can ask yourself right now is not, how do I recover what was lost? The most important question is far more personal than that. What part of me is reacting instead of holding itself with clarity? Because that is where any change that is not merely superficial truly begins. That is where the foundation is built or rebuilt. And that is where, quietly and without performance, the perception of who you are starts to shift, not in her eyes first, but in your own.